The morning they sold her, her mother wore her good dress. That was the detail Nora Calloway could not shake loose from herself. Not the laughter from the parlor, not the clinking of her father's good crystal brought out for the occasion, not even the words themselves, which she had heard through the half-open door while standing in the upstairs hallway in her stockings, one hand on the banister, having come down for a glass of water and found herself instead collecting something she could never unknow. It was the dress. The ivory one with the pearl buttons that her mother saved for church and Christmas and the mayor's dinners. She had put it on for this. Easiest thing we ever did, her father had said. Man didn't even haggle. She'd have driven any sensible man to drink inside a month, her mother replied. And then they had laughed together, the two of them, the way Nora had never once heard them laugh over anything she'd done right. She stood in the hallway for a long time. The candle she'd carried guttered in the draft from the window. When it went out, she stood in the dark and listened to her parents celebrate her absence while she was still in the house, still breathing their air, still technically theirs for another 72 hours. She thought she might cry. She found, pressing her palm flat against her sternum, that the feeling beneath her hand was not grief exactly. It was more like a door closing on a room she had always known was cold. She went back upstairs without her water. She began quietly and methodically to pack. The road to the Aldridge ranch climbed for most of a day. The man her father had hired to drive her, a thin, uncommunicative fellow named Peters, who smelled of pipe smoke and seemed to regard her with the wariness one might reserve for a crate of unstable cargo, said almost nothing for the first 4 hours. Around midday, when the pines began to crowd the road and the air took on that particular cold clarity that lives above 8,000 feet, he ventured a single sentence. "He ain't what people say." "What do people say?" Nora asked. Peters appeared to regret having started. "Various things," he said, and after that was silent for the rest of the climb. She had heard the various things herself, of course. A recluse, a man who had bought up half the mountain and then proceeded to live on it alone, which in her father's social circle was considered nearly as damning as poverty. He had refused 2 invitations to the governor's dinner. He employed a small permanent crew, but brought in seasonal workers at fair wages, which several of the larger landowners in the valley considered him quietly contemptible for. He was 34 or 35, no one seemed sure. He had been in some kind of war, or perhaps a mining accident. The stories varied on this point. He did not come down to town if he could avoid it. He had asked for her specifically. That was the part Nora had returned to, alone in her room in the days after overhearing her parents. Not the fact of being asked for, she understood she had been arranged like furniture, but the specificity of it. Her 2 elder sisters were by any conventional accounting far more marriageable. Clara was gentle and pretty, and knew how to make a room feel at ease. Margaret was capable and organized and had been running the household accounts since she was 16. Nora was the one who had argued with the schoolmaster, who had returned a neighbor's cruelty with a precise and public accounting of its ugliness, who had once spent an entire Sunday dinner explaining in careful detail why her father's business partner was a fraud. She had been right about this, which had made it somehow worse. She was 22 and had, according to various relatives, a tongue like a field blade and opinions no man wanted from a woman. And she was the one he had asked for. She could make no sense of it, and she had learned by now to be suspicious of things that made no sense, because in her experience they usually concealed something. The ranch announced itself first as smell, wood smoke and pine resin and the particular mineral cold of a high creek, and then as sound, which was the sound of work. A steady rhythmic hammering from somewhere behind the main barn. A dog barking twice and then going quiet. The creak of a rope under tension. The house was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself for something grim, some bachelor's fortress of uncurtained windows and accumulated neglect, and what she found instead was a long, low building of squared timber that sat in its clearing with a kind of settled authority, like something that had decided where it belonged and seen no reason to reconsider. There were curtains. There was a kitchen garden to the east side, not pretty but serious, put in by someone who understood soil. The porch boards were sound. A woman came out of the house when the wagon stopped. She was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with white hair pulled back, and eyes that took inventory of Nora in approximately 1 second. "I'm Vera," she said. "I cook and I manage the house, and I will tell you plainly if something is wrong. Mr. Aldridge is finishing in the north pasture. He'll be in before supper." "Thank you," Nora said. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for Peters to assist her. Vera watched this, and something shifted in her expression, just slightly, in a direction Nora could not immediately read. He came in as the sun was dropping behind the ridge, and the first thing he did was wash at the pump outside, which she watched through the kitchen window without intending to. He was taller than she'd imagined, lean in the way that came from actual work rather than spareness, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had been only approximately attended to. He dried his hands and face on a rough cloth and stood for a moment, looking out at the tree line, as if he was having a conversation with it. When he came inside, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her with an expression she could not categorize. It was not the appraisal she had steeled herself for. It was something quieter than that, something almost careful. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Cass Aldridge. I'm glad you arrived safely." "Mr. Aldridge." He nodded. He moved past her to pour 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it, which should have been presumptuous, and somehow wasn't. "I want to say something to you," he said, sitting down across the table, "and I'd like you to hear it out before you respond." She set her hands flat on the table. "All right. Your family was told I would pay the bride price after 30 days, once the arrangement was settled. I have no intention of paying it, not because I mean you any disrespect." He looked at his coffee cup and then back at her. "I won't pay a price for a person. I don't believe it's right, and I won't do it regardless of what arrangements other people have made." She looked at him. He held the look without flinching. "That will cause problems with my father," she said. "Yes, I expect it will. You knew that when you decided." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was calling to someone else across the yard, and a horse made a low complaint about something. "What exactly," she said carefully, "are you proposing instead?" He told her. 1 month, she would have her own room with a lock. She would work if she chose to, and rest if she chose to, and be treated as a person who was deciding something rather than a thing that had already been decided. At the end of 30 days, she could choose to stay or choose to go, and if she chose to go, he would give her a good horse and 3 months' wages in cash money, and she would leave with more than she'd arrived with. "Why," Nora said, "would you do that?" He didn't answer immediately. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I think you've been told your whole life that there's something wrong with you," he said finally. "I don't believe that's true, and I think you deserve the chance to find out for yourself." It was such a precise thing to say, and said so quietly, that Nora found she had no immediate response for it. She looked down at her coffee cup. The silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it had weight. "All right," she said at last. 1 month, she worked. This was not because anyone expected her to. Cass had been clear that it was her choice, but because she found within 3 days that the ranch had a grammar she wanted to learn. It was a language of necessity and sequence, of understanding which things had to be done, and in what order and why, and there was a satisfaction in that which she had never found in needlework or social calls. Vera taught her to turn butter without breaking it, and did not make a fuss when Nora broke it 3 times first. A wiry, sunburned hand named Tomas showed her how to read the high pasture for signs of weather, which plants turned up their leaves before rain, which way the horses went when the pressure dropped. She learned the water schedule, the fence rotation, the logic of the root sellers organization. She made mistakes and said so, and corrected them, which seemed to earn her something she couldn't name from the people around her. Cass was present in the way a landmark is present. She was always aware of approximately where he was, what he was doing, the specific sounds of his work. He did not follow her or watch her. He did not offer opinions on how she was doing things. When they worked near each other, they worked in a companionable quiet that she found, to her own surprise, restful. When something she did was wrong, he said so once, plainly, without unkindness. When something she did was right, he noticed that too, though he didn't always say it. She learned to read it in the brief stillness that came over him before he moved on. One afternoon in the 2nd week, she was mending a section of fence on the east side of the property when she found that 2 of the posts had been set wrong, not by much, but enough that the whole run was slowly pulling loose. She studied it for a while. Then she went and got what she needed and reset them. It took her most of the afternoon. When Cass rode by near sundown and stopped to look, she explained what she'd found and what she'd done. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence. "That was going to be a problem by spring," he said. "I know. Good eye." He rode on. She watched him go and felt something move in her chest, something she didn't immediately try to name. He told her about the old worker on a cold night in the 3rd week, when they were both sitting on the porch after supper and the sky was doing something remarkable above the tree line. "I was in town 3 years ago," he said. "October, I think. I had business with the grain merchant on 5th Street. He paused. "Do you remember a man named Harlan Bates? He worked for Caldwell's Dry Goods." Nora went still. "He was old," she said, and his hands shook. "And Caldwell decided that was a reason to refuse him his last 3 weeks of wages and tell everyone in the street that he was incompetent and a thief." "Yes, and everyone stood there," she said, and she could still feel it, the particular fury of that afternoon, the way all the faces had turned away. All those people just stood there. "You didn't." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I said what was true," she said. "Caldwell was lying, and I said so. I told everyone exactly what I had seen, and I told old Harlan that he should take Caldwell before the magistrate, and I said I would testify." She paused. "It was not a popular thing to do." "No," Cass said. "I expect it wasn't." He was looking at the tree line. There was something in his profile she couldn't read, some complicated thing moving behind his steadiness. "You'd never met him before that day," Cass said. "Harlan, he told me later. You just saw what was happening and you stepped in. Someone had to. They didn't, though." He said it without rancor, just as an observation. "Plenty of someone's there. You were the only one." The cold had come down with the dark and she could see her breath. The stars were almost violent in their brightness up here, nothing to dilute them. "You've been waiting 3 years," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I wanted to find the right way to ask." He paused. "Your father wasn't going to make it easy. He wouldn't have agreed at all if he thought you actually wanted me," she said. "He assumed he was placing an inconvenient problem." "I know what he assumed." She looked at him then, really looked, and she thought about a man who had watched one unremarkable afternoon in a dusty street and carried it for 3 years like a coal kept carefully alive against the cold, who had calculated and waited and figured out the only angle that would work and had used it not for himself but to give her a door she hadn't known existed. "That was a great deal of trouble to go to," she said finally, "for someone you didn't know." "I had a reasonable amount of information," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved slightly, and she thought that might be the closest she'd seen him come to a real smile. She looked back at the stars. Something warm had started beneath her sternum, slow and careful, like a fire lit in a long, cold room. Her father came in the 4th week. She saw the wagon from the high pasture and knew it before she could see his face, something in the way he held himself in a vehicle, the specific tilt of entitlement. She came down from the pasture at her own pace and arrived at the yard to find him standing in front of Cass with his chest out, using the voice he used on people he had decided were beneath him. "Made an arrangement," her father was saying, "and you have not honored it, and I will see you held to it by law if necessary." "Mr. Calloway," it was her voice. Both men turned. She was still carrying the fencing tool she'd been using. She hadn't thought about that. She thought about it now and decided it was fine where it was. "I didn't expect you," she told her father. "Get your things," he said. "You're coming home." She looked at him for a long moment, at the red in his face, the particular set of his jaw that meant he was frightened underneath the noise, and she felt something resolve in her, quiet and permanent as a stone settling into riverbed. "No," she said. "You don't have a choice." "I do, actually." She kept her voice even, which cost her some effort but was worth it. "Mr. Aldridge has given me a choice, which is more than you ever did. I have made it. I'm staying. He hasn't paid." "He won't," she said, "and neither should he. That's not how a person ought to be treated, and we both know it, even if only one of us is willing to say so." Her father's face moved through several things. He tried 3 more arguments. She answered each of them, not loudly, not with the heat she felt, but with the clean precision she had spent 22 years developing in rooms where no one wanted to hear it, and which turned out to be, she was discovering, exactly the right tool for exactly this situation. In the end, he left. Not gracefully. He said things as the wagon turned that she would not repeat and did not intend to remember. She stood in the yard until the sound of the wheels was gone, and then she stood there a moment longer. Cass had not said a word throughout. She turned and found him watching her with that quality of attention that had become familiar over these weeks, the kind that did not push or pity, but simply witnessed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she was. She should have expected the arrest. Later she would understand that she had, in some part of herself, that the fear which had been quietly sharpening in the days after her father's visit was not formless anxiety, but legitimate foresight. Still, when Tomas came riding hard from the low road on a gray morning with his face carved into something frightened and said they've taken Aldridge, Miss Nora, some business in town about a debt that ain't real. Still, even with the foresight, the fury came up so clean and cold it almost took her breath. She was saddled before Tomas had finished unsaddling. Vera came onto the porch with a coat and a look. "You know what you're doing?" Vera asked. "Not entirely," Nora said, pulling on the coat. "But I know what needs to be done." Vera looked at her for a moment and then nodded once, the way she nodded at things that had been decided correctly. The ride down took 3 hours. She knew what her father had done because she knew her father. A false debt claim, most likely, something that could be made to look legitimate long enough to cause trouble, to force Cass's hand or humiliate him or bring her home. He had never in her memory attacked a problem directly when he could approach it sideways. She arrived in town with cold hands and a very clear mind. The magistrate's name was Fowler. She had met him once, years ago, at one of her father's dinners, and she had correctly identified him then as a man who valued his own position above most other things and who was, underneath his carefully maintained authority, deeply uncomfortable with being wrong in public. She found him in his office. "Mr. Fowler," she said, "I need to speak with you about Cass Aldridge." She laid out everything she knew. She had brought from the ranch the ledger in which Cass kept his accounts. She had asked permission for nothing, and Vera had handed it to her from the shelf without a word. And she opened it to the relevant pages and showed Fowler the entries and explained in plain arithmetic why the debt her father had claimed was invented. She named 2 of the seasonal workers who had been present at the relevant transactions and could testify. She named Peters, the driver, who had been present for a conversation he probably wished he hadn't been. She was accurate and she was thorough, and she did not raise her voice once. Fowler looked at her across his desk. "Your father brought this claim himself," he said. "I know he did. It's your family, Mr. Fowler." She kept her hands still on the ledger. "I have given you accurate information. What you do with it is a matter of your conscience and your record, not mine. I'd like Mr. Aldridge released." The silence stretched. Fowler looked at the ledger. He looked at her. Whatever calculation he was running, she let him run it. "I'll look into the matter," he said finally. "I'll wait," she said. Cass came out of the county building 2 hours later into an evening that had gone amber and long. She was standing by the horses. He stopped on the steps when he saw her. He looked at her for a long moment. She was aware that she probably looked exactly like what she was, someone who had ridden hard and argued precisely and was currently running on something that was not quite calm but was holding its shape. "You came down," he said. "Yes." He walked down the steps and stopped in front of her. "Close!" The amber light was doing something to the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, and she was aware in the most inconvenient way possible that her heart was making considerable noise. "How did you—" "Ledger," she said. "And your credibility is apparently better established than my father's, which if you'd asked me, I'd have predicted." She paused. "Also, Fowler doesn't want a scandal. I may have implied that he would have one." "Implied." "Very precisely. Something broke open in his expression then, something warm and undone and real, and she realized she had never seen him look like that. He put his hand against her face, just his palm, careful as a question. She leaned into it slightly before she decided to. "Nora," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." They married on the first warm Saturday in May, in the yard of the ranch with the mountains behind them doing what mountains do, which is to stand there saying nothing and meaning everything. There was no church, which several people in the valley found objectionable, but neither Cass nor Nora had any particular investment in other people's objections. Vera stood with Nora. Tomas stood with Cass. The local minister who had agreed to come up the mountain had known Cass for 15 years and had the good sense to keep the ceremony short and let the occasion be what it was. The bride price was never paid. Her father did not come. Nora had sent him a letter that was courteous and clear and asked for nothing. When the minister asked her if she took this man, she looked at Cass, at the specificity of his attention, the way he had seen something true in a dusty street 3 years ago and had believed in it long enough to act. And she thought about the ranch with its cold mornings and honest work, the fence posts she had reset, the way the high pasture looked at first light, the sound of his voice saying good eye and meaning it. She thought about being a door closing on a cold room and how she had been wrong about that, how it had not been a door closing but a door finding, if you gave a door enough time. "I do," she said. Afterward, Vera put out the good food, and Tomas played something on a battered guitar, and the mountain air was exactly what it always was. Cold and clear and indifferent to human ceremony in the way that made human ceremony feel, somehow, more rather than less. Cass found her later standing at the edge of the yard where the trees began. He stood beside her. They looked at the tree line together. "You should know," she said, "that I am still opinionated and difficult and likely to cause problems." "I know," he said, "and you intend to find that acceptable."
Nora.
He was looking at her with that careful quality, the one that had undone her quietly over weeks. "I didn't come looking for acceptable. I came looking for you." She took his hand. The mountain said nothing, which is what mountains do. It was, she thought, exactly enough.